It's great to see you both again. Megan and Taylor are both returning champions who have been at the UIS Summit in the past and part of the UIS network for quite some time. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Megan, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Is this good? Are we good in the back? All right, good. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Megan Snyder, Chief Impact Officer at Unitus Community Credit Union, and I'm so happy to be here today. One of the areas I have the opportunity to lead at my credit union in Oregon are our strategic initiatives. We have three key ones, which is serving multicultural communities, our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, and then the third one is environmental and sustainability. So I love this conference. The content is amazing, and it means a lot to me, not just professionally, but personally. So I am excited to be here today and talk to Taylor. Taylor, it's good to see you. So let's hop into it. I know, like he mentioned yesterday, we already touched on AI. It was a great conversation. We're going to get to that. But first, I would love for you to just share more about yourself and the Financial Health Network, what you're up to. So let's just start there, and then we can get into the weeds.
Yeah, sure. Megan, thank you so much. This is also one of my favorite events. I regret immensely that I'm not able to be there with you all in person, but glad that I'm able through, as Dave was saying, the marvels of technology to beam in from Wisconsin. My name is Taylor Nelms. I think many of you know me. I've spoken at this conference in the past in a previous professional role. Today, I'm the Vice President of Research and Insights at the Financial Health Network. In that capacity, I lead a team of researchers who are focused on understanding how people actually live their financial lives, what contributes to financial health, what undermines it, and how institutions like credit unions and many other financial services providers, employers, policy institutions, regulatory institutions, and so on, how all of those different stakeholders can design for better financial health outcomes. At the end of the day, the goal of the Financial Health Network is really simple. We're all about improving financial health for all, especially those who have long been marginalized or underserved. And a big part of that work is research. Everything we do is anchored in an outcomes-based definition of financial health. We say that a financially healthy household is one that's able to meet its current financial needs and obligations, on track to meet future financial needs and obligations, and able to absorb and recover from unexpected expenses or drops in income. And even just listening to that definition, I'm sure that you can think about all of the various links, real and potential, between climate sustainability and emerging technology.
I love the discussion about how research is so important. We were talking about that yesterday in a group of how data can really just help you have those conversations or move the board and leadership. So it really is critical to have that piece, not just of the qualitative, but quantitative conversation. So love that. Okay, so speaking about data, the Financial Health Network has been measuring financial health in the US for 8 years now. When you look back over those 8 years of data, what trends stand out to you, Taylor? What can you share with us about the financial health and vulnerability of U.S. households? So what are the tailwinds? What are the headwinds? And what can you share with us, too, that speaks to not just 2025, but looking forward also?
Yeah, great set of questions, Megan. And I think that's a really good foundation for us to then dig into some of the questions and topics maybe a little bit more relevant to the conversations in the room. But at the Financial Health Network, we think that measurement data is really important because you can't improve what you don't measure. We measure financial health by asking consumers 8 simple questions across key foundational pillars of financial health: spending, saving, borrowing, planning, and protecting. And based on their answers to those questions, we assign them to one of 3 tiers, right? We assess them as being financially healthy, financially coping, or truly financially vulnerable, depending on how much they're struggling or not across those different pillars. So our flagship national data set is the US Financial Health Pulse. This is a multi-year research initiative. We're now in our 8th year, as you mentioned, It's one of the most comprehensive longitudinal looks at household financial health in the country, in the United States at least. And it helps us take the temperature of financial health across the whole country every year. But it also helps us understand where there are disparities, where there are emerging risks, what do the dynamics of resilience really look like? And I hope it gives leaders like those in the room evidence that you can really act on. So looking back on 8 years of data from 2025 and before, I think when you take a big step back, the story is pretty clear. Financial health disparities across the United States in particular are deeply entrenched. Less than a third of households are financially healthy by our definition, and that share of financially healthy households has really changed very little over time. At the population level, then, the share of the population that is financially healthy or financially vulnerable every year is pretty stubbornly static. One of the unique parts of the data set that we have at the Financial Health Network is that we can actually track individual households year over year. And at the household level, financial health is really surprisingly dynamic. So between 2024 and 2025, about 31 million households in the United States changed financial health tiers. They moved from financially vulnerable to coping, or coping to vulnerable, healthy to coping, coping to healthy, et cetera. And I think that when you combine that fact with the entrenchment of the overall kind of disparities in financial health at the level of the whole population, I think that tells us two things. Like, one, vulnerability is real, but progress is possible, right? Like, households wouldn't be moving up or down if financial health couldn't be shaped, right? By their own decisions, by the context in which they're making those decisions, or by the interventions of the institutions that they're interacting with. So between 2024 and 2025, we fielded this survey in the spring of 2025. So it's really kind of looking back from the spring of 2025 on to the prior 12 months. We did actually see some modest improvements. So we saw slightly fewer households with unmanageable debt, and we saw a small uptick in savings. I'll caveat that with those gains were not only modest, but we considered them to be pretty fragile. And with the ongoing volatility in the economic environment and policy environment, I would expect that we will not see the same positive momentum going into 2026. The headwinds are strong, right? Policy volatility leading to this challenging macroeconomic environment, ongoing and deepening affordability challenges across the country. And in our 2025 trends report, we do call out two very important emerging pressures that I think are especially relevant for credit unions. One has to do with worsening confidence in insurance coverage, which we have seen consistently decline since we started measuring this back in 2018. And growing concerns among student loan borrowers in particular. Both of those, I think, are trends to keep an eye on. So big picture, household financial health is dynamic. It's improvable, but the underlying vulnerabilities are also real. They're persistent. And ultimately, I think they're increasingly shaped by forces outside of any one individual's control.
Yeah, it's so complex, isn't it? It reminds me of the Alice data too. There's not a silver bullet here, but I love the hope, Taylor. I think so many of us in the credit union movement, that's what we show up every day for, is that hope that we can move that needle. So that's good, even with the concerning signs coming in. Okay, so let's get into it. Given the backdrop, let's turn to the two key things that we're here to talk about. So climate change and artificial intelligence, the promise to reshape household financial health. How can we get there? So we know climate events impact consumer financial health, and these impacts are often higher for already vulnerable communities. At last year's Inclusive Conference, I see Netta here, we heard the discussion, and we talk about it still a lot at Unitus, of it's too expensive to be poor. That disproportionate impact on increases to insurance or losing insurance, on the effects of raising utilities, our low-income households just can't afford that. So when we think about that, what does the Financial Health Network research tell us about how climate disasters and extreme weather events are already impacting households in our communities?
Yeah, this is not going to be a surprise to anyone in the room, right? I think we're kind of preaching to the choir here, but obviously, first of all, climate shocks and financial vulnerability go hand in hand. We do have some real data to back this up. Our research shows a pretty consistent pattern. Households who experience a natural disaster are significantly more likely to be financially vulnerable by our definition. So in our Pulse data, those who lived through a disaster in the last 12 months, far less likely to be financially healthy and far more likely to struggle with things like on-time bill payment, debt manageability, and short-term savings. We've conducted additional research on the specific links between climate change-related weather events and financial health. And climate events, we know, hit entire communities, but the impacts are not felt evenly, right? So low-income households and households of color in particular bear the heaviest burdens, and we see that dynamic play out in terms of the impacts on their financial health in the wake of a natural disaster as well. Our research also on the financial health of rural communities shows very similar dynamics. So rural families, especially renters, face higher material hardships after weather events and often have have smaller buffers to recover from those experiences. Climate shocks drive immediate spikes in essential expenses. So obviously temporary shelter, food, healthcare, housing repairs. And our data shows that, especially for these already vulnerable households, those spikes actually persist far longer than other families and that most families can absorb. So I think that's really important, is that the length of the tail of impact is longer for already vulnerable households. And then finally, even absent like big disasters, chronic climate stressors, so heat, drought, smoke from wildfires, these also do things like raise utility costs, disrupt work hours, they harm people's physical health, and ultimately chip away at financial stability over time. So we see that as well in some of our regionally disaggregated financial health data. I'll also point out that the declining confidence in insurance coverage that we see reflected in our consumer survey data is also in part climate driven. So, as I mentioned, the confidence in insurance coverage, that's the single pulse indicator that has dropped the most between 2018 and 2025. And we see that households who have recently experienced a disaster, they're significantly less confident that their insurance will protect them in a future emergency. Part of that, obviously, is you go through an experience where you actually have to rely on your insurance and you realize how inadequate it often is. But that's not just perception. I think it also reflects real affordability and access challenges. Communities with the highest disaster losses are also the least likely to carry residential insurance, renters insurance, home insurance. But we've done some particular research on renters insurance, and we see obviously in those areas that are assessed as higher risk, premiums are rising, coverage is shrinking, and in some places insurers are withdrawing altogether. And of course, that erosion of protection leaves families more exposed to the financial impacts of chronic climate stress, as well as even modest weather events. So households know they should prepare, but obviously preparation really requires resources, whether that's weatherization or emergency supplies, temporary relocation savings. These things are out of reach for the most financially vulnerable families. And I'll just point out that our research highlights that renters in particular face real structural barriers. They often live in more climate exposed housing, they have less control over upgrades, and they can face higher financial stress even before a disaster. So in some recent work, we've proposed 4 pillars to advance household climate and financial resilience. And I'll just mention them here, and then we can point folks to the full research brief. So the 4 pillars are: first, mitigation. Families need support to reduce climate risk proactively, but these investments are expensive and inaccessible. So here are things like climate financing that we've been hearing about. It I think is really important. Second, preparedness. So households need guidance and resources to build some emergency savings, to understand their insurance, to acquire adequate coverage, have a plan for displacement. I think, that kind of adaptation piece is really, really important. Like, these things are going to happen, so we need to be prepared for them. Third, response. When a disaster hits, people do need rapid access to relief funds. They need functioning payment systems. They need flexible credit. And here, again, preparedness helps us in our response moment, right? And the earliest stages after a disaster are often the most financially decisive for households. And then fourth, recovery. We had know from experience, long experience, that recovery is not only long, it's often very uneven, right? So for renters, for people with low incomes, for households of color, those with kind of tangled property titles who struggle to access insurance and government aid, the recovery is especially uneven. So households need trusted intermediaries to navigate their options, avoid frauds and scams, and ultimately invest in long-term resilience, not just rebuilding.
I love those 4 pillars. We, not just for the consumer, but at Unitus, you just made me think of something, Taylor. At Unitus, we're doing this type of exercise for our organization too. So how I'm taking those 4 pillars back though, because just to ensure we're doing this right, but we're going through scenario planning. What does it look like if there's a fire or an ice storm, or how does this affect not just our employees, but our members, our communities, so that we're really prepared for this. It's not a matter of if anymore. So how can we take the right steps? So great 4 pillars. Okay.
Megan, yeah, I would say that that's such a great point to focus on what the credit union can do internally. I think that those disaster response plans, they're often focused on those 2 middle pillars, right? Preparedness and response. And I think it is a great idea to take, the kind of broader view back, even for your own disaster response plan, and think about what are you doing right now for mitigation and what are you doing to plan for recovery?
Yeah, love that. Thank you. Okay, moving on to AI, which, by the way, I have a note to my children about cat videos after yesterday's discussion. AI is the hottest topic right now. It's our 2025 buzzword, I'm certain of it. What has the Financial Health Network's approach been to understanding the potential upsides and downsides of AI for consumer financial health? I think that's just really the big question, right, Taylor? We love AI, but is it hurting us? Is it helping us? Tell us more in regards to our climate.
Yeah, I think it's clearly a double-edged sword. So at the Financial Health Network, we view emerging technologies, and AI we put within that broader category of emerging technologies. In some ways, it's very special, and in other ways, we've been through this before, right? Like new technology in financial services or outside of financial services, that's not an experience that any of us are unfamiliar with. Obviously, AI is especially powerful. But we need to look at these emerging technologies through an outcomes lens. And in particular, obviously, we're thinking about financial health outcomes. In other words, the question that we're asking is not simply like, can we build it, right? But if we build it, will it, whatever it is, those AI tools, will they measurably improve how people spend, save, borrow, plan, and protect their financial health, right? So we need to be thinking not only just about if we can build it, but how we can build it so that they will have positive impact. So we embrace AI's potential. We see a lot of opportunity, and we insist on guardrails, in particular guardrails around transparency, accountability, inclusive design, and trust. So let me talk briefly about some of the opportunity, and then maybe we can talk about some of the risk, and in particular, kind of how do you design with those risks in mind. So what's the opportunity? I think one of the most promising pathways, at least in terms of AI's impact on financial health, is to design AI tools that can serve as financial navigators or co-pilots, providing scaled financial guidance layer for everyday decision making. I think we're seeing a lot of AI interest in kind of like robo investing and finding ways to help people kind of like maximize the returns on their investment portfolios. But I think that there's some more basic guidance here that AI can provide in terms of spending, bills, savings, navigating benefit programs, non-traditional income streams, and much more. AI, obviously there's a lot of interest in using AI to help reduce the cost, improve access, personalize support, and really work 24/7 to scale what's good about financial coaching and counseling, especially for people who've not had full access to traditional financial advice. I think importantly, this advice built well, has the potential to go beyond kind of generic skip your latte kinds of messages and make that advice more dynamic, contextual, responsive to real life. And I know that there are many who see a future in which AI is not only providing advice, but actually taking input from users and making decisions in alignment with those goals that a user provides in an agentic kind of way. I think that that's a fancy way for just saying like automating decision making. But I do see that there's some potential there, obviously with guardrails. I will mention we've started to do some research here at Financial Health Network to understand how people are already using generative AI in personal finance. There's lots of examples of experiments, but when we actually survey, a nationally representative sample of the U.S. population, we find that the usage of generative AI tools for financial advice remains pretty small. So in 2025, we saw that 7% of the population were using generative AI tools in some form in their financial lives. I will note, however, that that's double what it was the previous year, more than double what it was the previous year. So in 2024, we found that 3% of the population were using these tools, up to 7% in 2025. I expect that it'll continue to go up. The problem is access and awareness are uneven, and in particular, trust remains really, really low. So in our research, we flagged that only about 12% of consumers overall say that they trust AI for financial advice, and 43% actively distrust them. So there's some barriers here, I think, to adoption that maybe are overlooked in some of the excitement around the opportunity.
Okay, so talking about, you mentioned guardrails. I just wanted to jump into that a bit more. How can we ensure AI is a useful tool? What are some guardrails, Taylor, that we can look at or that you recommend as we move forward with AI in the coming years? Because as you said, I think it's just going to increase. This is a hockey stick that's on the way up for sure.
Yeah. I'm going to point out, and hopefully it won't get too technical, but I'm going to point out at least 3 key design challenges. And whether you're actively building your own AI financial coaching tool or other kind of financial services tool, or you're evaluating those tools, I think these are 3 things to keep in mind. So the first has to do with inclusive data sets. And I think we all know, this kind of adage, garbage in, garbage out. AI tools are only as good as the data they learn from. The data sets that have been used to build, the most popular large language models that sit behind things like ChatGPT or Claude, whatever it might be, those are built from the words on the internet, right? I think to truly improve financial health through the use of AI, we need training data sets that reflect the lived experiences and perspectives, attitudes, and decisions of underserved and marginalized communities, right? People with volatile incomes, people with lower wealth, people with limited credit histories, renters and immigrants and gig workers, et cetera. Those are the words, the voices that are not typically represented in the training models that are used to build things like ChatGPT, right? And if these realities aren't in the data, the tools are not only going to misestimate risk or misdirect advice, they're going to make assumptions about what people want out of their financial lives that are not aligned with their real goals and aspirations. And we risk widening existing financial health divides. So I think number one is the data sets that we're using right now are not inclusive. And so we need to really emphasize that. The second is I think that we are learning that for general purpose large language models, the insane wealth of data on the internet is like fine, right? But for high stakes domains like healthcare or financial services, where you have use cases that are quite specialized and the risks of being wrong are much higher, we actually need real human expertise embedded not just in assessing the outputs of models, but actually embedded in training and model development. In practice, this means that we actually need subject matter experts, lived experience experts, the voices of consumer advocates, the voices of financial health practitioners as inputs to the training process. So as we go through iterative rounds and we get various outputs from these large language models to particular inputs, questions, prompts, those experts can identify, yes, this is actually a good answer and this is a less good answer. We can stress test edge cases. We can identify where those outputs from AI can go wrong before they actually reach the public. I think that the role of experts in training these models is currently undervalued, and we need to value that expertise in the training of the models much more highly. Finally, I think that we need some real accountability mechanisms that close the loop with the communities whose data is actually being used to train these systems and then ultimately use them. And I think that means more transparent performance metrics. I think it means community feedback channels. I think it means ongoing auditing for biased or harmful outcomes. And I think it means a commitment to show that these tools are producing measurable improvements, again, in financial health, not just kind of automation for the sake of automation.